PRIM&R and ARENA have been, I mean, that's been my professional home in that sense, in terms of professional development since I got involved with it. My time as ARENA president was interesting because this was the mid to, what, 2004 or 5, I think. I should know what year I was president, but you can edit that out. The year I was president was, we were still seeing the effects of those assurance shutdowns of institutions. And so from one year our membership went to a few hundred people, or meeting attendance went to a few hundred, to over 1,000. We were outgrowing the places, the venues that we had traditionally gone to for these meetings, and our membership started growing. And increasingly, as the community of people that were in the trenches were coming to these meetings, the lines really started to blur between PRIM&R and ARENA. And there was honest ambiguity. I think for the man on the street at a PRIM&R meeting, or the woman on the street at a PRIM&R meeting, if you said, are you a PRIM&R member, they'd say, heck yes, I am. I remember asking PRIM&R board members, are you a PRIM&R member? Yeah, I am. But technically they were ARENA members. But the distinction in many people's eyes was becoming meaningless. But this was a huge tension because you had this, I wouldn't quite call it grassroots, but that's sort of what it was. You had leaders like Ada Sue Selwitz and Susan Kornetsky and Gary Chadwick and others, Moira Keene, Helen McGow, built up this ARENA structure with some help from PRIM&R, but a lot of it was really grassroots. They were sort of allowed to use the PRIM&R name, and they could have control over one day of the PRIM&R ARENA conference where they came up with the program plan, but it was, you could register for it separately. It just happened to be in sequence with the PRIM&R conference.
Okay, so I just have to interrupt because even I am not sure the difference in those days. So distinguish the two for me from those days.
Sure. So PRIM&R was the original organization, and they were, we were saying, by the time I got involved with it, how it was always explained to me was that PRIM&R dealt with like the big picture issues, bringing in the Bob Levines to talk about ethical issues, or the Jay Katzes or whomever. And ARENA, the Applied Research Ethics National Association, were the people in the trenches who were managing these IRBs and getting the work done. And so our one-day program was focused on those sorts of tracks. How do you train IRB members? How do you interpret the expedited review categories and put them into practice, sorts of things. But as time was marching on and the conferences got bigger, the distinctions between the two became less and less. So on the PRIM&R days, you were seeing nuts and bolts topics creeping into their breakout sessions. And on the ARENA day, you were seeing these highfalutin ethics issues creeping onto their agenda to be discussed. And so that distinction was blurring at that level, and the national conference for the IRB was then and still is PRIM&R's sort of marquee event. You had all the people in those hallways who often intersected with the organization only that one time a year. I don't think they cared about the difference. They knew they had to register for the two things at the same time but separately, and that they were billed as separate meetings, but I don't think they cared about that. They were there to learn, and whether they were a PRIM&R member or an ARENA member didn't matter. And so the board of directors at that time started talking about not whether it was time to reel in ARENA, but whether it was time to acknowledge that distinction had lost meaning. I mean, ARENA would have never happened without the grassroots efforts of those people, Barbara Stanley, all the folks that helped build it up with acknowledging very little support from the organization itself, but got to the point where it was established now. And that separate identity, if anything, might have been sort of hurting the larger program because it suggested separations that really weren't there. Legally, ARENA was part of PRIM&R. And the decision was made to reintegrate ARENA back into PRIM&R. This was like the hardest thing ever. I was president at the time, talking with at the time, current ARENA council members and former ARENA presidents. A lot of people didn't think it was a good idea, that PRIM&R was taking it away from the membership and taking away this opportunity for really being part of sort of a grassroots-led organization. And it was seen as a structure to move up the ladder in a sense, and to have this like professional extracurricular thing that you can say you owned. I personally wasn't totally convinced. As I looked around the PRIM&R board, for example, there were and are continue to be a number of former arena presidents. So it wasn't like there was total exclusivity between the two. The PRIM&R leadership was riddled with past arena leadership. I don't think they had to be maintained as separate organizations. I certainly didn't see any need to split off and form a completely separate membership organization. Nobody, I believe, was in a position to quit their day job and to start running a professional membership organization. And the reality was, if that happened, I think PRIM&R would have started their own new membership organization. But by that point in time, the office had started to mature, and there were more pieces in place to ensure the longevity of things and keep it moving along. And so the really difficult decision was made to put the two back together. And it was heart-wrenching to do that. There were a lot of personal friendships I had that were lost over it and didn't really rebound. And I feel bad about that, but I still believe that for the long-term health of the organization, it was the right thing to do. It presented its own challenges. How do we let members stay connected to the organization? Where do we make them feel like they fit in if arena's gone? We wouldn't have the council anymore. And I would say we are still working on that. I mean, we now have subcommittees to the board of directors, basically, but a membership committee, a certification committee, an education committee, and members can and do participate in those. So, and our membership has continued to grow. So we certainly haven't seen a loss of membership as a result of this. To me, I think we're able to put out, now as a board member, able to say, we as PRIM&R are able to put out a more consistent message about who we are. We're a nonprofit organization dedicated to the promotion of ethical research. We have a vibrant and active membership of over 4,000 people who come to our meetings, who volunteer to help do the work. I think ultimately it was the right move, that it has strengthened the organization, that we continue to reap the benefits from it. But it was a very difficult time. And